Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time and interest today for coming here today. I wanted to address a few issues that I think there appears to be some miscommunication regarding the policies and procedures of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office as it relates to jail booking procedures. I want to take a moment and go through several items that I think might help in clarifying, and then of course I'll answer any questions that you might have. The first thing to understand relative to the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and our jail is we're full. I don't mean that facetiously, but I think that is a fact that is not necessarily new to anybody. It shouldn't be. The Salt Lake County Jail has been full, in essence, from essentially 2000. Shortly after opening our doors, we reached capacity, and we have been at capacity since that time. Granted, there have been fluctuations in jail bed capacity due to funding. As an example, as you all know, in 2000, the Oxbow Jail was still open. However, it was shut shortly thereafter due to funding concerns. So there has been some ebb and flow of available jail beds, but the bottom line is anytime we have beds available, they are, for all intents and purposes, full. Forgive me for reaching back and forth. While that has occurred, we have remained relatively static as it relates to jail beds. The graph below demonstrates beginning going back to 1991, in 2000 when we had the Metro Jail at 2234, then we shut down Oxbow jail beds, and we went back down to a total rated capacity of 1,866. And then, as you'll recall, in 2009, we opened Oxbow, one unit of Oxbow jail back up, and we have remained essentially static since that time. Overlaying that particular statistic are the statistics above it. One of which is population. Salt Lake and the state of Utah in general, but Salt Lake County has seen what can only be described as rapid population increase. By many statistics, Utah is one of the fastest growing states in the union, and Salt Lake County has had its fair share of growth. Some statistics that we have shared with this group in the past and I think are instructive is a statistic, for instance, from 2010 to 2014, Salt Lake County grew a total of 190,000 people. That is equivalent to the population of Salt Lake City. During that period of time, as I want to be very clear, our jail beds have remained essentially static. In addition to population increases that have occurred over that period of time, there are other factors that affect the Salt Lake Valley and its jail, some of which is the crime index. The crime index, which is over my left shoulder here, that we derive from Bureau of Criminal Identification. Those statistics ebb and flow as well, but in many instances we do have increases in crime. If you overlay on top of that still, that in the Salt Lake Valley we have more police officers. Most jurisdictions in the Salt Lake Valley, including the Unified Police Department and others, have increased the number of law enforcement officers that service our streets. In fact, we have even seen the creation of new police agencies. As an example, the Utah Transit Authority did not exist previously and does now, and they are responsible for not an insignificant number of bookings. All of these factors combined result in increasing pressures on the Salt Lake County Jail. Going back to the opening of Oxbow Jail, the single time in my particular term as sheriff that we have increased jail bed, we increased a total of 184 jail beds, and these numbers below are raw numbers, ladies and gentlemen, so I just want you to be clear about that. 2009, roughly a rated capacity of give or take 2,000. We increased a net number of beds by 184. It is important to understand that when we increased that 184 jail beds at Oxbow, we did so on a net flat budget. What happened during that period of time is I was authorized to open 184 new beds, but I did not receive new funding. I had to take funding that we were utilizing in the ADC, so what I did was I reduced staffing and other logistical components within the ADC to take those resources and take them over into Oxbow. The goal of which was, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, was to ensure that the Oxbow Jail was reinvigorated and therefore would be ready and able when funding was available to open the additional 2 units that remain at that facility. And as you all know, the Oxbow Jail has a rated capacity, give or take, of about 600. So if we can get the Oxbow Jail opened, that would give us another net increase of approximately another 400 beds. Our jail bookings. The jail bookings fluctuate, and those fluctuations that you see in there that go from 2009 down to 2010, 11, those are predominantly related to jail cap management restrictions that we have had in place in this jail historically. I am not the first sheriff to implement jail booking cap management plans or restrictions. In fact, the first jail booking restrictions, at least in my memory, occurred back in 2003 when then Sheriff Aaron Kennard implemented jail booking restrictions for exactly the same reasons that we have today, and that was just prior to our moving into both the Oxbow and the Adult Detention Center. Many of you in this room have been around long enough to remember the days when the Metro Jail down at 4 South and 3rd East was at absolute maximum capacity, and we began to even move inmates into the 9-story tower of the Metropolitan Hall of Justice. And that quickly filled to capacity. That was in response to some prostitution and other issues that had raised many concerns here in our community. So as soon as we opened them, they essentially filled. What has the Salt Lake County Jail done to educate our community relative to these particular issues? In addition to a plethora of news stories, which I'm happy to hearken to, and I'm sure any of you with an internet connection can look at them as well. It's a common theme that has been running for decades in this community about the jail overcrowding. When we began to identify that the jail overcrowding had reached such a crisis level and that we were engaging in a practice, specifically overcrowding releases, which I'll be glad to get into here in just a few moments, that are debilitating. Individuals were being transported to the Salt Lake County Jail, they were being processed, and then they were being walked out the back door back into communities. It was having a very detrimental effect, not only at the jail, but to the community of South Salt Lake, and also to the criminal justice system. Because as individuals would be transported, booked, and allowed to be released, their offenses were not being cleared. Their warrants were not being cleared. They would immediately go back out into the community and reoffend. The only rationale really was a short-term incapacitation, oftentimes of between 2 and 6 hours, for an individual to come down and be processed. Yes, it did allow individuals to be taken from one jurisdiction and moved to another. Short of that, it had very little impact, and in fact, as I've indicated, it had a net negative effect. One of the negative effects that it had was giving this community the perception that the jail and the criminal justice system in general was being effective. If you perpetually take items in your home and you put them in a closet and forget about them, the stuff is not gone from your home. You still have the stuff in your home. It's just out of your view for a little while. You've never resolved those items. We all have them in our basement. We all have that phenomena. And what you can do is you can continue to build a bigger and bigger house, but at some point in time, you have to do something to begin to clear those closets. Human beings are not meant to be put in closets. It was for that reason that we determined, and when I say we, Salt Lake County officials determined to implement jail booking restrictions. How did that occur? The first order of business was to consult with the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office, who is our legal representative and manages our both our civil and our criminal issues, but in this instance, we talked to them about the legality and the appropriateness of jail booking restrictions. They helped us craft a jail booking restriction model that was efficacious and, most importantly, was fair and equitable, because the statutes in this state require that the sheriff of any county treat every jurisdiction similarly as it relates to their ability to utilize a general fund resource, which is the Salt Lake County Jail. We crafted those booking restrictions, and then we briefed the county council on the plan. When I say brief the county council, some will ask, did we receive authorization? The jail cap management plan is the function of the sheriff in consultation with the council. They were certainly consulted and had input relative to this particular cap management plan, and you can speak to them. They certainly agreed relative to the management of our facility and its budgetary issues. After we did that, we went to the Criminal Justice Advisory Council, CJAC. That is a group that is empowered by Salt Lake County that brings together members of the judiciary, members of law enforcement, human services, criminal justice services, and the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, and we briefed them on the CAP management plan. After briefing that group, we received significant feedback specifically from the judiciary about concerns relative to our CAP management plan. They brought to our attention deficiencies in that plan that would have aggravated some circumstances in the state and municipal courts. We went back and we rewrote that plan. That those amendments to that jail CAP management plan pushed back our estimated rollout of the initial CAP management or booking restrictions by approximately 6 months. After we did that, we resubmitted it to CJAC and received their concurrence. Then, in August of 2015, we met with every law enforcement leader in Salt Lake County. We held here at the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office a jail population crisis meeting. I have that PowerPoint presentation for you, and I would be happy to provide it to you. At that meeting, we communicated with every chief and explained to them the budgetary and population realities of our circumstance and asked them for feedback on options relative to managing our population. After that meeting and receiving their feedback, we then developed the final draft of the booking CAP management plan, which was delivered to every law enforcement agency in this valley. And a briefing was held at a meeting that is held monthly called the Law Enforcement Agency Directors Meeting, LEADS. After we notified the agencies, we we gave them a formal implementation date so that they could inform their officers of these new procedures. We then developed, in conjunction with an organization called Code for America, it is an organization that comes into communities and provides computer assistance on a federal grant basis, we developed an app. The application, which was handed out valley-wide and was listed on our websites, etc., provided information to all officers and jurisdictions about the fluctuating nature of our jail CAP management plan and those booking restrictions. It also provided an opportunity for any officer to enter data about an instance where he or she was going to book an individual but did not. We informed every agency that the purpose of that app was to provide us feedback so that we could continue to monitor on an ongoing basis the effects of the jail CAP management plan and the booking restrictions. Then, ladies and gentlemen, on March 3rd, 2016, we held a press conference. I have the PowerPoint here with me, and I'm happy to provide copies to everybody again that outlined the jail CAP management plan and their need for implementation. To my understanding, most media outlets were present, and I have many of those reports that many of you generated after that press conference, in which many of you did a tremendous job of outlining the very specific nature of this CAP management plan and alerting our community as a whole to the fact that we were going to be doing business in a different fashion. Included in those documentations were statistics that indicated, for instance, of all individuals who arrive at the Salt Lake County Jail, this is pre-booking restrictions, 52% are never admitted into general population. I want to be very clear about that. Half of all individuals who are transported to our jail, and I don't know how this statistic relates to others, but walk out our door. Why? Because of bail, because of overcrowding releases, because of failure to files, because of a variety of different circumstances. But individuals, the vast majority, or at least half of all individuals that come to a jail simply do not stay because they have legal rights to leave our facility. 22% of the population at the time of this press briefing on March 3rd, 22% of the individuals that were coming to our jail were released as a result of overcrowding releases. In 2015, and this is a statistic, I'm probably going to screw this up, to my memory, we were inching up to nearly 7,000 overcrowding releases in that particular year. That is 7,000 people that are brought to our jail, processed, and simply walked out the door. It was one of the highest numbers of overcrowding releases we had had, certainly in my tenure as sheriff, and I think going back historically, one of the highest ones. It's simply we were revolving door these individuals. Recently, there have also been reports that suggest that misdemeanants are not allowed into the Salt Lake County Jail, or that few misdemeanants are allowed into the Salt Lake County Jail. That is simply not accurate. I asked our staff prior to this briefing today, and I'm happy to do this for any day that you would like, but I asked them to take a snapshot of yesterday, February 23rd, 2017. On that particular day, 88 unique individuals were booked into the Salt Lake County Jail. You need to understand that when they come into the jail, it is not as simplistic as saying they have 1, 2, 3, or many. They have a variety of different encumbrances. They have many charges that are associated with that particular arrest. Very complicated to process these respective individuals. So to put it in perspective, of the 88 bookings, there were 218 individual charges associated with those 88 human beings. It is important to note that of those 218 charges, 15 of them were infractions. These are traffic violations. Now, they were booked in conjunction with other issues, but the suggestion that we don't book individuals for anything but a felony is simply not accurate. 111 of the charges, the individual offenses for which these individuals were booked, and granted they're in conjunction with a variety of other issues, were misdemeanors. And 92 of the individual charges based on these individuals were felonies. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, is that a CAP management plan, one that is designed to try and triage and house the most serious offenders, given the very finite resources that we possess, is a complicated endeavor at best, and one that has to be done in a fair and equitable approach to all agencies that arrive at our facility. It is also important to note that Salt Lake City, who was the subject of many of the comments in recent reports, are, in that particular snapshot, responsible for 20% of those bookings. That is slightly higher than their population percentage in the Salt Lake Valley. Historically, if we go back and we do multiple snapshots, Salt Lake City is generally responsible for 20 to 30% of all bookings in our facility. That runs, again, relatively average historically. Another statement that seems to be gaining some traction is this idea that officers cannot book individuals if they pose a particular public safety risk or problem. Anecdotal stories about an officer being assaulted, or a circumstance where an officer just simply couldn't get some bad guy into jail. That too is erroneous. Officers from any jurisdiction can and do routinely request overrides to our current management plan for public safety exceptions. This policy was specifically provided to all law enforcement agencies and also is available in our app that we had. And I'll give you just some indications of those overrides. This is a listing of the various overrides that have occurred. On 5/22 of 16, a gentleman had a failure to stop at the command of a law enforcement officer. That was his only charge. That individual contacted the Salt Lake County Jail, and a form was filled out, which is what we ask people to do. Here's the form right here that asks whether they want to have an override to our jail cap management plan. They fill that out, and then they are allowed, given our officers, the jail supervisor's discretion, to override that. To my understanding, a very small percentage of those individuals who have requested overrides have been denied that. And I'll be happy to provide you those specific numbers. Again, I'm happy to provide the listing here. I could go through many of them. Here's on July 17th, individual for a misdemeanor C, intoxication with 17 active warrants. That was a Salt Lake City officer who requested an override, and it was granted. Another officer requested an override, 719, for misdemeanor B, threats of violence. That too was granted an override. Retail theft, override. Interfering with officer, override. Failure to surrender ID, override. Often and frequently, we understand that circumstances cannot be completely identified in the booking or charging documents, but that other information has to be relayed one-on-one from a human being to another human being about the individual offender's risk to our community. Remember, we at the jail, our job is to receive and receive lawfully and try and process. But if we do not know what goes on, we cannot respond to that. Another indication seems to be that Salt Lake City, as a jurisdiction, it's taken a lot of publicity recently because of the very high-profile nature of the crime that is occurring in their downtown corridor, specifically the Rio Grande. It is terrible, and it has been terrible for many, many years. Again, I have press reports dating back for my entire tenure as Salt Lake County Sheriff, and I think I could go back for my entire tenure as an officer here in this valley, in which that particular area had significant crime issues. On a repeated basis, that area, they have attempted multiple mass arrests in an attempt to try and curb the issues down there. In all of those instances, the Salt Lake County Jail received those arrests, sometimes with direct coordination, sometimes without direct coordination, but we would receive those bookings for those particular arrests. In addition to that, we entered into an agreement with Salt Lake City Police when they assigned about 100 officers down into the downtown area in the Rio Grande. You'll recall when they had their Metro Bureau down there. They assigned a large number of officers down there. We entered into an agreement with them, which was unique, and it was a top 10, more or less. What we said is we would carve out on any given day at least 10 beds for those individuals who they deemed to be their high-frequency offenders. 10 may not sound like enough, but that was the number that Salt Lake City requested at that time that we carve out for them so they could have some discretionary arrest authorities. That program, from my standpoint, was highly effective, and it was disbanded at the time the Metro Bureau was disbanded. We have since offered, and I believe we have even reinstituted the top 10 or the similar mechanism that is in place right now in the Salt Lake County Jail. In addition to that, many of you will be familiar with Project Diversion. That was a program that we in Salt Lake County approached Salt Lake City with respect to initiation. We wanted to utilize that program for a number of reasons, not the least of which was for demographic sampling so that we could move forward on some other initiatives, and they agreed. That program, which I think some will argue it was good and some will argue it was bad, that program required $1,300,000 of Salt Lake County funding, the vast majority of which were treatment beds. After the cessation of the Project Diversion program, those treatment beds have remained open for the Salt Lake City Police Department almost exclusively. They and their counselors that they have on staff have been referring individuals into those unfilled treatment beds and continuing to utilize the revenue associated with that. To my knowledge, that is unique to Salt Lake City and to the problems that are very significant in the downtown corridor. In addition to that, I approached the Law Enforcement Agency Directors Group at a meeting not long ago and suggested to that group, to all agencies in the Valley, that we were contemplating a program here at the Salt Lake County Jail in which we would carve out, we would isolate nearly 300 specific beds solely for Salt Lake City's problems. I did that because I needed to alert other Valley chiefs that if we netted down 300 beds for Salt Lake City, those beds were coming out of the other agencies. In other words, Draper would not have those beds, Taylorsville would not have those beds, Sandy would not have those beds. These beds were to be carved out to address solely the issues with Salt Lake City. Why would we suggest such a thing? Because we here at the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and Salt Lake County government in general recognize that the issues that are going on in the downtown corridor are not solely a Salt Lake City problem. Quite the contrary. They're affecting everybody in the state of Utah. It is a horrendous, difficult situation in which we have open-air drug dealing, etc. And we were prepared to enter into a program with Salt Lake City where we would identify specific mechanisms, legal mechanisms, in consultation with the Salt Lake County District Attorney, to ensure that Salt Lake City could temporarily be apportioned a significantly larger number of jail beds than their population, or their revenues that go into the Salt Lake County General Fund were required to do so. That offer has never been communicated. We've never had communication back relative to that offer. In addition to that, we have ongoing state and county initiatives that I will generally discuss when I raise a few final issues. What is the Salt Lake County Jail doing and has been doing relative to these issues? Well, recently, as I think all of you are aware, we have approached the Salt Lake County Council and we have requested funding to build between 300 and 1,000 new jail beds at significant expense to the residents of Salt Lake County. That initiative is moving forward. In the audience today is Chief Kevin Harris. Kevin Harris has been assigned full-time as the project coordinator to begin moving that process forward, and we are already into the architectural and engineering related RFP processes for that particular issue. We have also been in consultation with all other county partners and are working on a coordination meeting to develop the programmatic nature of that particular facility. Those revenues have been tentatively identified, but again, that is a significant expenditure for the taxpayers of Salt Lake County, which I do not possess the legal authorization to authorize. I have to go to my fiduciary, which is the Salt Lake County Council, and ensure that I have the revenues to do that. But we are moving ahead as fast as we possibly can. In addition to that, I have stated publicly that I am supportive and have been supportive of additional revenues, specifically tax increases, to fund jail beds, specifically the opening of the Oxbow Jail. When I opened the Oxbow Jail in 2009 on net negative revenues, I suggested at that time that we enter into a tax increase to provide revenues for that particular facility. Or if that essentially, that kind of anticlimactic, wasn't it? Boom, that's it. I don't want to be facetious. Look, I'm happy to take any questions, comments, or concerns that you may have relative to these.
So is it a matter of you have empty beds but not the funding to manage them, or is it that nearly every bed is full?
It is both. So the presence of unfilled beds, it's kind of like having I can't use them because there's no money to use them. If I'm going to expend money, I have to have the authorization, right, to expend the money and to expand services. It's the same with any official. I can't open them up without the revenue to do so. So yes, we have unfilled beds. We have about 600 or 400 unfilled beds. And by the way, we've had this discussion multiple times. There's a difference between the functional number of beds in a jail and the ability to fill them all with human beings. You cannot fill 100% of every bed in a jail. And the reasons for that I'm happy to go into, but the bottom line is you simply can't. But as it relates to the unfilled and unfunded beds, I cannot utilize them because I do not have revenues.
Is the revenue more for guards in order to manage those people, or is it just the cost of food and everything else to actually have them in?
Both. There will be an initial cost relative to Oxbow. That is, there are some infrastructure costs. The estimates on those right now range anywhere from about $500,000 to $800,000. There's some coolers, and there's ovens that have to be reactivated. There's some upgrades, to the infrastructure. Okay, so that's the first chunk of money. Then, of course, I have to have the authorization for O&M, operating money, right? So I have to be able to have the funding for the staff, which includes nurses, includes civilian support staff, includes physical officers. Then I have to have the money to fund the actual daily rate of those inmates in our facility. So if you take all of those elements combined, we're quickly approaching $8+ million to open the remainder of Oxbow Jail. It's a significant impact. That is going to be difficult, considering we're also in the process of trying to break ground on a new jail. It ain't cheap.
The 218 charges that you mentioned that just happened yesterday, you mentioned 111 of them misdemeanors. Were any of those, say, like standalone misdemeanors, or were they, say, necessarily tied to other felonies or some other activity?
I'm happy to get you a specific breakdown of that. My guess is, and this is a guess, yes, there will be standalone misdemeanors. I think everybody's aware that if you commit a DUI, you are booked. If you commit, that's right, domestic violence. You're familiar with the booking restriction, which has been publicized. So there are some misdemeanors that are mandatory books from our perspective for obvious reasons. And we've tried to identify those in a way so that officers don't waste their time or their efforts relative to transport. If they know they have a particular offense level, come on down and do it. But if there's a question, come on down and we'll talk about it, or call. Again, we have a number that we've issued for officers to call down there and check on the issues. By the way, we have a number down there relative to medical issues. If an individual has an offender on the street and they're concerned about their inability to be booked because of medical restrictions, which we have, they call down and they say, I've got a gentleman here, or I've got a lady here, and here's what they have, and we can tell them right on the scene. That individual must be seen at a health facility and be cleared before they're brought down. Oftentimes, if they do call, they don't bring them. Yes, ma'am.
I've heard from numerous police officers who are on the streets every day say your jail cap management plan is not working and it is creating more crime and more concern for officers. What do you have to say to those officers who reached out to me to say they're spot on with my reporting and that your cap management plan is not working?
Well, I think that this idea that it's my cap management plan and that we have done this arbitrarily, I don't expect every officer to understand the macro nature of this issue. It is a complicated and difficult issue. What I expect, Ms. Dujanovic, is that the administrators in this valley articulate to their officers the circumstances that we are in. And the fact of the matter is, whether it is a jail, whether it is a cancer treatment facility, whether it is a school, whether it is any entity that has a finite budget, everybody must make some decisions that are based on triage. The Huntsman Cancer Institute cannot treat everybody with cancer, so people die. They have to determine which people have the money, which people have the worst cancers, which people have the cancers they can treat. Now, there are many people that would say, why is it that my relative is being excluded from that treatment center? Now, I'm more empathetic than anybody can imagine, but if people think that we don't take it as seriously as that, they're dead wrong. The reality of this is that I cannot communicate with every single officer, but I have gone down personally to the division down in Rio Grande, and I have spoken with officers one-on-one and indicated to them, if you have arrest situations that you need to get into our jail, call us, come down, and we will identify if we can book them. So this blanket statement that it is raising crime, that gives our agency the responsibility for all of the other macro influences, ma'am. And if you think that population increase doesn't affect crime, and you think that initiatives at the Utah legislature don't affect crime, and you think that issues with the Utah State Prison with reductions in their facility don't affect crime, if none of that has any impact, the increase in homelessness in general, which every one of you in this room have been involved in and have been articulating over and over again, that has an impact. So to say that crime is increasing because of a single policy seems to me to be slightly naive. Now, I do not blame officers for being frustrated, and as you know, I manage a fair number of officers in this valley. And they have expressed much concern to me, and I do my very best to explain to them the realities that I face along with them. But if the suggestion is that we do this for some reason other than fiduciary responsibility and management responsibility, that is inaccurate. So will I take criticisms about good management? No. Will I take the concerns of our officers seriously? You bet I do.
They say they do call here.
Ma'am, if they call down here, we've got it documented. And if they don't document it, I don't know. So if you say they, you better give me a name and you better give me an example. Because the examples I have here in writing indicate that officers daily come down here and override our cap management plan. So I'll see your theys and I'll raise you documentation.
So what happens when they do call in? Are they always accepted? Or
No, ma'am. In some instances, they call us and the circumstances do not justify or cannot be accommodated. But again, it is a case by case. Sometimes there are circumstances where officers' articulation turns out to be different than it is. Or we find an alternative. Maybe we can find them an open bed at VOA. Maybe we can find them some other diversion. But at some point in time, this valley and these agencies and we as a society have to start learning that it is not just the jail who enters into these diversionary programs. Where are the treatment dollars promised? Does anybody here think that the right place to put the mentally ill, the right place to put the substance abuse, chronic substance abuser, is to cycle them through this jail ad nauseum, only to have them return back down there. If we opened up 200 beds in there tomorrow, ma'am, I can almost guarantee you that 200 individuals would backfill it in there. At some point, we've got to start thinking smart rather than just thinking linearly. And these complaints and some of these statements fail to take into consideration what are very complicated yet very real issues related to the management of a correctional facility in a major metropolitan area.
Cap plan then here to stay?
I'm sorry? No, ma'am. No cap management is here to stay, because if we open up more jail beds, we would bring them down. If we get a new jail, we would bring them down. If they shutter some of the homeless facilities down there and we have a less of an increase from one particular jurisdiction, if a justice court were to open up a drug court or have a diversion in their situation and lessen our population, all of these affect the jail. We don't just take human beings from Salt Lake City's Rio Grande. I have justice courts throughout this valley that continue to sentence people here for no insurance. I have justice courts that sentence people here for barking dogs. I have judges that send people over here for non-booking releases for dog at large. Everybody thinks that resource is endless, ma'am. My job is to manage it.
How do you kind of determine the level of seriousness that is needed to say, okay, this particular misdemeanor can override the current management?
So there's a lot of art to it. So here is kind of a situation. You have an individual that is, let's say that he is mentally ill, and individual is taken to a local emergency room, and they've gone up there, and by the way, this is not uncommon. Psychiatric intern or a physician takes a look at him and says, gee, we can't keep him, he's not a direct threat to his other. But here's this officer with an individual who's clearly mentally ill and is incapable of managing himself, right? He's either going to continue his violent actions or he simply is at risk because of problematic behavior. That individual comes down to our jail, I'll guarantee you we'll take him. And we do it not every day, I don't want to go overboard here, we do it regularly. The individual still has had to have committed a crime that is articulable on the part of the Salt Lake City or the Sandy or the West Valley officer, and then they communicate with us. And our job is to look at this human being and say, have we tried everything else? And if we've tried everything else and there's nothing else, the jail is the last resort. But that is why we have to save these particular open beds for these kinds of circumstances in a situation where we've been overcrowded for 20 years.
You mentioned a little bit, you said you understand why officers can be frustrated. I think all reporters have worked with officers, we've heard that complaint before.
Yes.
But you've also said that you've talked with the chiefs. Are the chiefs just not doing a good job of communicating that with their officers, or are they just not taking advantage of the process or know to call in?
You know,
That's a complaint we hear a lot.
Yes. Yes. Look, my job, unlike others, I'm not here to criticize or to critique any other agencies. And I really wish people wouldn't critique ours, because I don't know what they've done and not done. I respect my colleagues out there. We have tried to work with them effectively and efficiently. We have offered our suggestions within the context and the limitations that we have. But what they do out there, you know what I mean? I don't know. You work in an environment, I'm sure, where some of your colleagues are often frustrated because of administrative decisions and individuals don't understand why. And when individuals are frustrated and they don't understand why, they react. Communication is a very difficult thing, even in organizations of 50 and 100. We've got 3,000 officers in this valley. Do all of them believe that the jail's policies are the sole effect of these problems we have? Gee, I don't know. But I don't, brush with that broad of a brush. What I say is, some will understand it, some won't. Whether they understand it or not, I think it is our collective responsibility to view these things in the light of facts, sir. So again, what the chiefs do, I don't know. I can tell you what I do, and I'm happy to lay it out.
Given that there are some officers that see it as a policy that maybe is causing a problem, that, it's not just one reporter that was saying it. It was police officers. I think one of them used the word ridiculous.
Yes.
is there any kind of maybe more training that you think needs to be done to clarify what officers can do in misdemeanor situations? And do you think maybe policy changes might be, you mentioned that no policy is here to stay forever. But
Right.
do you think that the policy changes need to happen here at this level, or maybe just better training for other agencies?
Well, I'm going to get all philosophical on you here for just a minute. To blame an officer, the officers, myself included, we have lived in a culture for many, many years in which the solution to many of our problems was arrest. That has been our job. We go to a particular problem, and what we do is we say, we're going to write a report, we're going to try and protect somebody, we're going to do a deal. But when there's a significant issue, arrest is a very common, resolution. And so what an officer is not necessarily prepared for, and that goes right from the ground level all the way up, is what other alternatives are there? And the reality is, in our community, there aren't a lot of alternatives. I mean, a lot of officers would prefer to take an individual who is intoxicated and carrying on in the downtown area or anywhere else in this valley and take them to VOA or to an intox or to a detox. You know why? Because that individual could be safe, that individual could be dropped off quickly, that individual you wouldn't have to do a screening, you wouldn't have to do a lot of other issues, right? So the officer would satisfy the need, but it wouldn't necessarily be an arrest. It would be a diversion of some kind. Youth services is a classic example in this valley, and by the way, you want to see a overcrowding. In this valley, we have a significant issue with juveniles, and individuals take them to the youth service center over there, and it's jam-packed. But officers use it on a regular basis because it's a non-arrest diversion, right? Because they don't want to take them to DT, or they can't take them to DT because DT has restrictions and has had them for the last 20 plus years. So to answer your question directly, do I empathize and understand why officers are frustrated? You bet I do. I'm not that far from the street. Can I train them all? What would I train them to do? What we've been asking many people, the legislature and others, is please give us some other tools here. Which brings me to my last statement that I want to make. There are some criticisms that we have not communicated relative to some of you in this audience, and that is just not true. When we receive a grandma request, we respond. I have a grandma request in my hand right here, and we responded to that. And after we responded to that grandma request, our public information officers continue to follow up with that inquiry on a regular basis relative to answering questions. I did not do an on-camera interview relative to this particular issue, and I will tell you why. We are involved in very delicate conversations with the Utah legislature relative to funding a variety of initiatives. The nature of those conversations are, by their very circumstances, they're delicate. I am not going to do anything to disrupt those conversations. I respect the state legislature, I respect my county officials, and we are engaged in those conversations. To some extent, I feel like, remember Dick Nixon, who told everybody all the time, I've got a plan, and it never came to fruition. If my plan, or the plan, I want to be clear on that. If the plans that are being discussed amongst a variety of entities do not come to fruition, I'll be the first to come to you and say, this is what we were talking about and why. If they come to fruition, I'm going to be very excited about it. But I promised people that I would not communicate to reporters about this specific issue until those negotiations were done. And when I didn't, I had reporters go out and report the facts and indicate that I refused to go on camera. Now, the one thing I pride myself in is communicating with you, my colleagues, and I view you as my colleagues. To my perception, I have not ever refused or denied information. That is not my job as a public official, and I'm happy to do so. What I would hope is some deference relative to my inability to do on cameras, rather than send information in a written format and have my public information officers, whose job it is to communicate those facts. If we ever relay information that is inappropriate or incorrect, I'm happy to discuss that as well. But relative to the suggestion that I simply will not talk, I think this alleviates that. Ms. Dujanovic.
Information officer emailed me and said.
Yeah, I've got the list of them right here, ma'am, including some of the emails that went out to you at 10 p.m. at night. In fact, your specific statement. Hello again. Just one question I forgot to ask, so I guess you only had one question. What are the current jail booking restrictions? And then she goes on to answer you right here. No problem. Today we're at phase 4, step 10, meaning that we will only accept felony 3s and above. So from my standpoint, the questions were asked and they were answered at 10 o'clock at night by our hardworking staff.
So my question is that what did you, she responded to me that you did.
She did respond to you, right?
She did, you did.
Yeah, here's the.
request for an interview.
Ma'am, and I just told you why. A request for an interview can comply with a written, it can comply with a PIO because they speak on behalf of the agency. So because I don't meet with you personally and go on camera does not give you the right to tell people that I did not respond. We responded, ma'am, and here's the documentation.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can you go back to that slide?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be available for you one-on-ones.